The latest reports indicate that Javi Baez is going to make his free agent decision sooner rather than later. Should the Mets sign Javi Baez this offseason, and to how big of a contract? I'm going to break down all of that on today's episode of Locked On Mets.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans listening to Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Locked On Mets is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. Now, on today's show, I'm going to break down Javier Baez's free agency. In the first segment, I'll go through his career. What has he done up to this point? What is he going to get based on those numbers? In the second segment, I'll go through some other comps in recent years in free agency. What type of contract range will Baez be looking at? And then in the last segment, I'll give you my verdict. Should the New York Mets sign Javier Baez into what contract? Before we get to any of that, though, I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on Twitter at FinkelsteinRyan. You can also find some of my writing about baseball and about the Mets at justbaseball.com. So Javier Baez is a player that Mets fans were clamoring for years. If you remember back in the 2013 to 2016 range, really, there was always these rumblings that here's this Cubs team building around young position players. Here's this Mets team building around young pitching. Are these two sides ever going to come together and make a trade? Because the Cubs had like three shortstops. They had Gleyber Torres, they had Addison Russell, they had Javi Baez. The Mets had all the young starting pitchers, obviously. The two sides never met on a trade, but that was always something that was talked about. And Baez was always the hot name to be moved because it took a while for him to establish himself. Also, Starlin Castro, I think, factored in that mix as well. Now I'm thinking about it. He was the incumbent shortstop with all the kids that were coming up around him. But it was Baez that moved around the infield, that didn't get the job right away. Eventually, after Gleyber Torres was traded, Starlin Castro previously traded, Addison Russell had domestic violence issues. Once all of that happened, it became Baez's job, but it took a long time for him to be the franchise shortstop for the Cubs. And in those early years, he really struggled. 2014 makes his debut, had a 54 WRC plus, a negative WAR, hit 169, only a 229 plate appearance sample size, but that was a pretty significant one to make you at least hesitant as to whether he would ever pan out. He also struck out 41.5% of the time. It's alarming. Moving forward, 2015, did not play a ton, only played 28 games, 80 plate appearances, was better, 97 WRC plus. And again, I should mention, WRC plus is weighted runs created plus, measuring a hitter based on a league average of 100. So slightly below average in 2015 for Baez. 2016, the World Series year, obviously had a big impact in the playoffs. Defensively, he always has a monster impact, but offensively, there was still the growing pains. A 273 hitter, but a 314 on base percentage, 423 slung percentage, a 94 WRC plus. He did hit 14 home runs that year, 50 RBIs, or 59 RBIs, I should say, 50 runs scored. But again, still not an elite offensive player. You have 2017, hit 273 again, 317 on base, 480 slugging percentage, hit 23 home runs that year, 75 RBIs, WRC plus of 98. So still had not broken through as an above average hitter based on that metric. He was putting up WAR seasons at that point, just over 2. Then we get to 2018, the best season of Javier Baez's career. That year he hit 290, a 326 on base, 554 slugging, 131 WRC plus, had 34 home runs, 111 RBIs, a 5.4 F WAR season. If you are Javi Baez's agent, You are saying what he was in 2018 and even 2019 and the second half of this year is what he is moving forward. You're trying to flush all those other down seasons and pretend like they didn't happen. But he was very good in 2018, 2019 as well. Solid season, 281 hitter, 316 on base, 531 slugging, 29 home runs, 85 RBIs, a 4.3 F4, a 112 WRC plus. This year, 265 hitter overall, 319 on base, 494 slugging, a 116 WRC plus, 3.6 F4, 31 home runs, 87 RBIs. If we look at him and his career as a whole, 264 hitter, 307 on base, 477 slugging, 103 WRC plus, slightly above league average. And then you have all those home runs, 149 home runs. We know what Javi Baez brings to the table. He brings great defense, although at times his flashiness might lead to some errors. But I mean, really, that is an incredible benefit that he brings to your club, that he makes all these ridiculous plays, that he's a highlight worthy player at all times. He brings a speed on the base pass, which you like. He brings an energy that is just incredible to watch on a daily basis. I was never a Javi Baez fan because I would go to his Fangraphs page, right? And you'd see the numbers and you say, man, this is a flawed hitter. I mean, for his career, he strikes out 29.3% of the time and only walks 4.8% of the time. That's not going to lead to a ton of success. If you look at Francisco Lindor, even when he was struggling this year, his baseline is so much higher than a Javi Baez because he's still drawing walks and he's not striking out a ton. So Baez, he just puts himself in such a hole because that plate discipline is not great. In the second half, the Mets improved it, but we don't know if that's sustainable moving forward. And it does concern me over a long-term deal that Baez could be erratic with the production you're going to get. He could have incredible seasons. He could also have seasons where he strikes out 35% of the time and hurts you offensively more than he helps you. The thing about Javi Baez that you're always going to like is he does hit the ball out of the ballpark. And what you need, and we saw particularly this past season, you need guys that put the ball in the seats. And the Mets just didn't have that. And you brought Baez over, and it did change the dynamic of your ball club because you finally had somebody outside of Pete Alonso that was hitting those home runs. He is a player that I think has so many intangibles that you're not signing him based off of the stats that I just laid out because the statistical argument just isn't there to give Javi Baez $25 million a year. It's not. It's not there. And I'll get into some comps in a minute. There's other guys that had much better numbers that didn't even receive contracts with an AAV of $25 million. But when it comes to Javi Baez in the specific situation that the Mets have right now, it is a fit that I think they should pursue. It just has to be at the right cost. So what we're going to do in the next segment here is try to figure out what that contract range will be, and then we will discuss whether it is worth it for the Mets to bring back Javi Baez next season. I love Thanksgiving. All the good food and treats, and dessert is always the best part of any feast, but maybe this year you want a dessert that's just not so full of calories and sugar, which is why it is the perfect time for Built Bars. Built Bar is the new holiday dessert where you can feast on something delicious but feel good about it. One slice of pie can run you upwards of 300 calories, and that's on the low end, where Built Bars are only 130 calories with only 4 grams of sugar, and they come packed with plenty of protein. You can replace that coconut cream pie with a coconut Built Bar or go for a raspberry Built Bar instead of that raspberry pie. There are lots of good flavors out there that can replace any pie. They come low in calories, low in carbs, low in fat, but they are high in protein. And they come covered in 100% chocolate. There's going to be new surprises all month long with limited time flavors arriving at built.com. So check the site often. There's nothing like a Built Bar Black Friday. So mark your calendar because there's going to be a huge event with all sorts of surprises. Go to built.com, use the promo code LOCK15, and you'll get 15% off your next order. Again, that's promo code LOCK15, 15% off at built.com. So I'll be honest, I really struggled to find free agent comps for Javi Baez. There's just not a lot of players like him that hit the market at shortstops that are just so dynamic, but also the age. There's just it hasn't happened often. I couldn't even find a shortstop outside of Manny Machado a couple years ago who actually fit a similar bill, and Machado is a better player. So it was really tough. I had to kind of expand my search for just infielders or just contracts that can maybe foreshadow what Baez is going to get. Last offseason, the one example you can look at is DJ LeMahieu, different players entirely, but both infielders. LeMahieu got 6 for 90 from the Yankees. That's an AAV of $15 million a year. Interesting because I feel like Baez is being presented as having a stronger market than that, but LeMahieu, a better player, albeit older, 32 years old, but coming off a batting title in 2020 for whatever that's worth, shortened season, but he did hit 364 with a 177 WRC plus. In the year prior, very good as well at the Yankees, a 327 average, 375 on base, 518 slugging, a 136 WRC plus. Now, the thing is, he just had a bad year. So that contract not looking great so far for the Yankees. You go to Josh Donaldson, year prior, um, again, not the best of comps. Donaldson 34, but just looking at an infielder getting some big payday in free agency because there hasn't been a ton of big paydays given out in free agency in the last 5 years in general. But with Donaldson, you're looking at a 4-year, $92 million deal, an AAV of $23 million. Again, you could argue Donaldson may be a better player, but because of the age, the comp isn't the worst when it comes to a contract. Could I see Javi Baez signing a 4-year, $92 million deal this offseason? Absolutely, I could. It actually makes a lot of sense. Go to Mike Moustakas. Maybe a more similar comp than any of the ones I mentioned, not for the defense, not for the look of the player. I don't think you could find two players that have games that look different than Mike Moustakas, a bigger guy, just not an electric player like a Javi Baez, but players that do derive a lot of their offensive value with the home run ball. And his F-WAR going into free agency, Mike Moustakas, was only 1.2 less for his career than Baez is at right now. So a little bit better of a comp than you would imagine. 4-year, $64 million deal. So that's a $16 million AAV. Go to Eric Hosmer. Again, we're stretching the range here because there's just not a lot of free agent contracts to look at over the last 5 years. But he got an AAV of $18 million a year over 8 years. I think that is instructive when talking about Baez because the more years he gets, the lower that AAV will be. If he wants a 7-year deal, I don't see him getting $20 million a year. If he wants a shorter deal, okay, he might get at least 20. So that is the reason why I included Hosmer. You have Ian Desmond, another sort of flawed player when he signed with the Rockies, and he got a 5-year, $70 million deal. That's an AAV of $14 million a year. You go to George Springer. Again, we're stretching the realm here. George Springer, an elite outfielder compared to Javi Baez, but he was the one contract outside of JT Realmuto that you could look at last offseason where a position player got a significant deal. He got 6 for 150. That's $25 million a year. Baez, not quite the same player that Springer is, so I wouldn't expect him to get $25 million a year over 6 years, as some have projected. Unless his market is just better than I'm giving him credit for. If you look at his numbers, I don't know if Baez should be getting a contract as great as the one Springer got a year prior. Then you get to the other comp, as I mentioned, Manny Machado, the last shortstop to get a big deal. He got 300 over 10, $30 million a year. Again, he's a better player than Javi Baez, as is Lindor, who we all know got the $341 million. $34.1 million a year for the AAV. Let's talk about the projections from some of the sports publications out there. You got The Athletic projecting that Javi Baez would get $172 million over 6 years. It's a pretty steep price tag. $28.6 million a year for Javi Baez. Not the way I would spend my money. I'll be honest. That's a big contract. I think the Mets, they're going to get into that realm of playing a player close to $30 million a year over that period of time of 6 years, I would want to maybe even give a little bit more for a Correa than to tie myself to Javi Baez, who again has had so many up and down plateaus and valleys in his career. But we'll go to MLB trade rumors. I think this is maybe the best comp or the best projection, I should say. $100 million contract, 5 years, $20 million a year, 5 years. That makes a lot of sense. The New York Post had him at 150 over 7. That's $21.4 million for the AAV. Definitely better than the Athletic at the 28.6. That just seems really unrealistic to me. And hey, if you're Baez's agent, maybe that's what you're pushing for. I just don't know if the market's going to be there, especially if they want to get a deal done before the CBA expires, which is apparently what Baez is pushing for right now. He wants to get a deal done. With all that said, to try to get some direct parameters here of what we could be talking about for a Javi Baez contract, I think you're looking at $20 million a year based on his perception. That's what they're going to be trying to get. Something in that range where they're getting close to $20 million a year. Now, if it's a 5-year deal at 5 for 100, seems like it's realistic to me. It's not the longest of contracts. Maybe you can bake in some incentives to get to that 100. So maybe it's a little less risk for the team. Maybe you can put a team option on that 5th year with a buyout, and then you can get out of that contract if he is not performing. I could see different machinations where he gets that $100 million, but I really think that if he's going to get to $100 million, that is the highest that AAV is going to be. I could also see him having to take 6 or 7 years to get over $100 million if the market is not great for him. And that is where we get into the longer deals. That AAV, I think, is going to creep below $20 million. So if he wants to get $20 million a year, he's got to think a little bit shorter term. If he wants to bet on himself, that is how he's going to get a higher average annual value. If he was to sign a 2-year deal, maybe he could find a team that says, you know what? Let's give him 60 or let's give him 55. And they're just banking on a big season. And you put in maybe an opt-out after the first year, something creative where you give Baez a lot of money up front. Also, I've seen some reports that maybe he'd be willing to accept a high man, couldn't get that one out. A high AAV 1-year deal. It's tough to say AAV so many times in a row. It's not a good abbreviation. Average annual value. Should I just say it all out so I don't stumble like that? Anyway, maybe it is a 1-year $30 million deal for Javi Baez. And would you want that because there's less risk, or are you concerned that that's going to eat too much payroll for what you're looking at next season? A lot of tough questions to ask. There was a contract I floated, and I would venture to say I was the first one to say this because this was really early on to his Mets tenure, where I was looking at Baez and I was comping him to Yoenis Cespedes, and I said, give him the Cespedes contract. And I think that is the most ideal outcome for the Mets. If you remember, after the Mets traded for Yoenis Cespedes, he got a 3-year deal worth $75 million. I'm going to talk about what that contract looked like, how that could translate to Baez in this free agent decision, and whether the Mets should pull the trigger on bringing Javi Baez back. We'll get to all that in just a minute. BetOnline is back and better than ever, now featuring a new web interface for the start of the basketball season with more props, odds, and lines available than ever before. BetOnline remains your number one spot for all the basketball and football action this season. Head to their new updated desktop or mobile website to sign up today and receive your 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit just by using our promo code Locked On. From basketball to football, NHL, boxing, and UFC, right to your favorite Vegas casino games. Don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available for the 2021 season. BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to bet on all your favorite sports. Bet online, where the game starts. Let's get down to it, folks. Should the Mets sign Javi Baez? This is a really tough decision. Because if I was to go just based on my head and just look at the numbers, it's a flawed player. He's going to strike out a ton. You never quite know if he's going to be hot for a season or not. He can have down years where he just is not helping you enough offensively, where he can drag down your lineup, and then he could pop off. I could see Javier Báez winning an MVP one year. Could see it happen. If he plays the way he did in the second half over a full season, just red hot, rips 50 home runs, he has ridiculous potential, but we're at a point in his career that I don't know if he'll ever tap into it. He tapped into it for a couple of years, had some seasons where he was in the high fours, that 5.4 F4 season in 2018. That's probably the peak of what you're talking about. And there's no guarantee that you're going to get more than one of those years over a 5-year deal. Maybe you do. Maybe he is the perfect fit for New York, and you get a player that's going to give you a 5 WAR season every year, and he just blows us all away. But based on what we had to look at right now, there's no guarantee he is going to be a great player over a sustained period of time. With that said, he does fit this roster. And again, as I've mentioned on recent podcasts, if he wants to be a Met, and he's a good player still, I would explore bringing him back at the right price. And I get back to that contract I floated, I want to say a few weeks after the Mets got Javi Baez. It was probably right after he came back from the injury and had that torrid month. So maybe at the end of August, you can check the tape and find where I compared Javi Baez to Yoenis Cespedes and really how the numbers he was putting up were Cespedes like. I know we look at the 2015 Yoenis Cespedes that dragged the Mets to the playoffs, and we say that is as good as it's ever going to get. But as I explored in that podcast, everyone around Cespedes was awesome. Cespedes was the best of the bunch, but the entire lineup contributed, and that led to him getting probably vaulted up into a status where he was praised more than he maybe deserved, that he was credited with more of the Mets' success than he deserved. But still, he had a great year. He hit free agency, and then he was waiting for that phone to ring, right? Okay, was it Brody at the time? It was Brody. They were looking, man, Cess, we just cannot find that $200 million you want. No one's giving it to you. No one wants to sign you. You're a flawed free agent. I'm sure they didn't tell him that, but they might have been thinking that. And so what he had to do? He had to settle for a 3-year, $75 million deal. I think that is a great comp to what you could give Javi Baez, and I like the structure of that deal as well. For Cespedes to get him to sign, the Mets front-loaded that first year. It's at 27.5. They gave him a big signing bonus, over $10 million. They got him back. If I was Steve Cohen of the Mets, I would structure a contract very similar, although I wouldn't even necessarily front-load it. I'd make it flat, 25 a year over 3 years, and opt out after the first season. Or if you want to get really creative, if you really want Baez around, maybe give him the opt out after year 2. Has 2 good years? All right. Has a great year? You still have him for that extra season. That could be something the Mets could do here because I think Cespedes, even back then, had a little bit more leverage than Baez does now. If he wants a deal before the CBA expires, I don't know if he's going to get his full value, but then again, sometimes it's better to rush to the cash like a James McCann did last year, as opposed to letting things play out when you have a bigger free agent like a Carlos Correa that you're kind of attaching yourself to. You're talking to teams right now and you're saying, you don't want to miss out on Baez because we're going to accept the contract soon. You don't want to miss out on him waiting around for Correa, who's going to drag this thing out the whole offseason. So if that's the case, if there's interest to return 3 for 75 does make a lot of sense. And I think the opt-out can be in there where it's attractive to both the player and the team because you could get out of that contract even sooner than 3 years. And I would not make the mistake the Mets did last time with Yoenis Cespedes, where he opts out. They make this great structured contract, right? Sandy Alderson did a fine job bringing the guy back on your own terms. He has a good season in 2016. He opted out. And then the Wilpons, I'm sure at that point it was probably just Jeff making classic mistakes. Oh, we love him. He's blowing kisses to our fans. We'll give him a 4-year monstrous contract that he'll end up not performing on because he got chased by a wild boar and fell into a hole because it is the New York Mets. I don't think Baez has a ranch. That's a good thing leading into these negotiations. I want to end this on a positive note, though, because I feel like I've been a little bit down on Baez throughout this podcast because I looked at the numbers. And when you look at the numbers, that's generally the sentiment that you're going to get as you're analyzing Baez as a admittedly flawed player. But what we saw down the stretch, I think that should translate next year. I think that Javi Baez is a player that you can't just look at the box score and the stat line because what he does, avoiding a slide to come home and score on a play, maybe he got on base, via an error. So you don't even see that affect the batting average or anything else. But then once he was on base, he went first to third on a shallow hit ball to center field. And then there was a pass ball that just got away from the catcher, and he comes around and scores with an amazing slide. Little plays like that can change the fortunes for your ball club. And there's a reason why Baez was such a big impact player for all those Cubs teams. I do think, despite his flaws, he's a winning player. Also, I think if you're just talking about the business side of things, Javi Baez is a draw. I went to a series in September, the one against the Cardinals, that almost signified the end of the Mets season. And when I was at Citi Field, I was shocked at how many Javi Baez jerseys I saw. Shocked. Javi Baez quickly became a fan favorite. There was a lot of Puerto Rico flags for him and Lindor, but I almost saw as many, if not more, Baez jerseys than Lindor jerseys, and Lindor had been around the whole year. So I think if you know that he draws fans, and you know he's also the best friend of your best player, that you need to have a much better season next year. I do think the two of them together leads to more success, and that is why Lindor had his best month of the season in September. So bring the two of them back, and it at least solidifies your infield. And the one thing I will say to close here, ever since the Mets made that trade at the deadline, I have been operating under the belief that Javi Baez was going to come back. I don't think that they were planning on Baez being a rental when they made that move. I think there was a belief that a reunion would be a very realistic outcome this offseason. We will see now if that ultimately comes together. Anyway, that's going to be all for today's episode of Locked On Mets. As always, thank you for listening. Make sure you follow, rate, and review wherever you get your podcast. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show at Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen every day. Now for your second listen, check out Locked On MLB Prospects. Hosted by RM Layton, Locked On MLB Prospects is the best place to go to learn about the stars of tomorrow. You can find Locked On MLB Prospects wherever you get podcasts.